listeners, readers, all you curious people who love curious literature. I'm so glad you've tuned in. I'm Kimberly Ford, best-selling author, former adjunct professor at Berkeley, editor, lecturer, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Today, we are diving into Gustave Flaubert's unbelievably revolutionary Madame Bovary. So, a couple of tips, as always, very briefly. One is that it's ideal if you can have the book in front of you. If you don't, not a huge deal. We're going to be doing quite a bit of close reading, looking at the level of the sentence, word choice, that sort of thing. But if you don't have your text in front of you as you're listening, no problem. I will be sure to make sure that you're anchored in the text as we move along. If you would like a somewhat more immersive experience, if you'd like to see how I've conjured yet another background from yet another space in the exact same office, in my office here in my home, check out the YouTube channel where you can also today see what I think is actually like a very Madame Bovary kind of an outfit that I've got going on. As always, the lecture will be presented in three parts. We have the first part, which is just going to discuss why we are reading this book, a little bit about the biography of Flaubert, and then we'll dive into the prose, taking care to look very carefully at at the title and at the dedication, a couple of different things, and then we'll dive into the prose itself. In the second section of this lecture series, we're going to talk about how revolutionary this novel is, both in terms of having been the very first realist novel, although Flaubert disavowed any membership in any kind of actual literary school. We're going to talk about why this is often seen as the very first realist novel, and in fact, sort of the realist, sine qua non, the realist. Is that what that means? I think that's what that means. It's the realist, it's the best. It's the non plus ultra. Is that right? Anyway, so you should, this is, if you're interested in literary schools such as realism, then this is, the second part is where you're going to learn about this book as a realist text. Then we will also be discussing in that second chunk the very revolutionary free indirect style. If these things are sounding confusing, I will definitely break them down for you, and they're not confusing. It's simply sort of fancy words to describe why, in fact, this novel is so genius. And then in the last section, in the third part of this installment, we'll be talking some more about the incredible prose. All of these sessions will really delve into why the prose is so exceptional. But we'll talk a little more about the prose. And then we're going to talk about irony and pathos. So on television these days, you all who've listened at all know that I love television. And there's no genre I like better than sort of very dark comedies. And I think in lots of ways what Flaubert is doing here is a dark comedy. And the reason for that is there's lots and lots of irony in the novel, but it's really, it's sort of hand in hand with this incredible pathos, so that you have this real dose of sort of humor and of Gustave Flaubert poking fun at the bourgeoisie, but also this real sense of pathos. You really, you're feeling for these people as much as you are, sort of chuckling at their trials and tribulations. And then we're going to talk about translation. I'm an absolute nut about translation. I love it. In the third section, we're going to discuss some of the real challenges of translation, and then we'll look at the close of the novel. Okay, so we're going to dive on into this concept of why we should read Madame Bovary. And, it may seem obvious just because it's one of these sort of huge classics, but that is not, for me, that's never reason enough to read. Besides, there are lots and lots of classics we could be reading, and we will over the course of time. But this is I think this is a very good one to dig into. So it is a 19th century novel, which is, it's a very different animal than the 20th century novel, obviously, and then certainly than the contemporary novel. But because in many ways it was so revolutionary, for me, it doesn't feel quite as old as it is. It was actually published in 1857. So it's 166 years old, which in some ways sounds like too recent for it to have been published. And also it seems like just absolute eons ago, especially when you look at what's happening in the novel and how far we've come in terms of industry and technology and I mean, I guess women's rights, although that's, somewhat debatable these days. But so we're looking at a novel that was set in the middle of the 19th century. It was the Second Empire in France, so it's one of those Napoleons. So it's still this large struggle between the monarchy and the people. And it's part of the revolutionary nature of the novel is, in fact, that we are talking about the middle class. We are talking about the bourgeoisie. Okay, so we're going to talk. I think it's important to read if this question is sort of why are we reading this? Part of it is how revolutionary it was, both in terms of style, but also in terms of content. So one thing I want to read quickly, I will be pulling almost exclusively from, I love Lydia Davis. I'm a huge fan of Lydia Davis. And I think she's translated a lot of Proust, a lot of French in general, but a lot of Proust. I'm looking over to that wall because that's where all of my French novels are, including her version of Swan's Way. But she has an introduction here, too, that I think is very wise. On page 11 of this introduction, she says, its radical nature is paradoxically difficult for us to see. Its approach is familiar to us for the very reason that Madame Bovary permanently changed the way novels were written thereafter. So this is Lydia Davis, who is an incredible scholar, an incredible writer in her own right. But she is really pointing out the way that in some ways this book does feel very sort of contemporary and modern because it really was revolutionary. And again, not only in the style, I've now lost my note card here. Oh yeah. Not only in terms of style, but also in terms of content. So we are, the title alone tells us that there is a woman at the center of this novel. And it's not, it's a woman who, no spoilers here, but, things don't go super great for Emma Bovary. But there are a lot of strong women in the novel. There's a lot of questions about the role of women. There's a lot of questions about consumerism. There's a lot of content in the book about sort of, social climbing and about class and about education that are all really, really relevant still today in the 21st century. The other reason I think to read a novel like this is simply the question of endurance. There is a reason why this book, I mean, I literally, I have 4 different copies right at hand. I didn't even go look in Bill's office, in my husband's office, because it's one of these books that, if a new translation comes out, I will buy it. And I read it probably every few years. It's just an incredibly important, enduring novel. And I think it is always interesting to look at what it is that has survived. I recently read a book by Gertrude Atherton about California that was actually amazing. But that is an example. My poor friend Gertrude Atherton, that is a good example of a novel that has not endured. It is still in print, in kind of one of these weird prints where you get a sense that they've just made it for you, in the back of the factory and shipped it off. But it is not, it is no Madame Bovary, and our friend Gertrude is no Gustave Flaubert. So I think it is interesting to look at why something like this has endured, and in fact, why Madame Bovary is such a cultural icon, I think, in lots of ways. Okay, now we're going to discuss a little bit about Gustave Flaubert's biography. He was born in 1821 in Rouen. I think he was born in 1812. I think I've done a little bit of numerical switcheroo here. I'm going to go back and take a look at that. It was either 1812 or 1821. I'll get back to you. In Rouen, in Normandy. So those of you who are watching the YouTube channel, there will be an image of that at the end, the map of France. I think probably most of you are familiar where Normandy is. It's kind of up, in the what is that? That is the northwest of France, right across the English Channel. It's kind of in that saddle that sits on the English Channel, and right across from England. And it's a part of France that was, the Normans came and the weather is cold and it's kind of, you think of, bulky sweaters and you think of rain and you think of more like England weather, certainly than we would find in some place like Provence. He was the second son of a doctor, and in lots of ways, this freed him up. So he had an older brother. His father was a surgeon, which was a very important thing in their family. This father was very accomplished, and Gustave was not so accomplished. His older brother was a surgeon, and that sort of took a lot of the pressure off. he was going to go to law school, and in law school, which he was not loving, he had the first of a series of epileptic seizures that he had, and he was brought home largely by his mother, who he was very close with. It sounds very much like Proust as I am saying that. They both were very close with their mothers. But he was not sad about leaving law school. And at that point, he essentially decided that he, as someone in the upper middle class in Normandy, son of a surgeon, he was going to devote himself to writing. And he lived for a long, long time with his mother and a niece that he was raising in a little town called Yvetot. I think that's correct. Which, interestingly, this is the same part of France that Annie Ernaux comes from, and we are going to read. This is the next step in my queue. Is Annie Ernaux's The Years and Happening, which she just won the Nobel Prize last year, and I have always loved her work, and I'm dying to dig into it. But one thing that I have found very, very interesting is that Flaubert, who is from Normandy and is writing about the bourgeoisie, predated by 150 years-ish, this second person who was winning the Nobel Prize, who was from literally like his exact same town, and who was writing about a lot of the same issues. I'm really, really psyched to look at the sort of interplay between the two of them, because Annie Ernaux, part of what is revolutionary is she has a woman oftentimes at the center of her fiction, in much the same way that Gustave Flaubert has Madame Bovary in the center of his main work. But also Annie Ernaux is really talking about the working class in lots of ways. And she becomes an intellectual and sort of is able to look at it from a very writerly point of view. But she was born not the son of she was not born the son of a surgeon. She was born the daughter of people who have a café épicerie, like a little store cafe kind of a thing. So she really brings the working class to the fore in a way that is really revolutionary and deserving of the Nobel Prize, apparently, and also was totally revolutionary in terms of style. So tune in for that. But I do think the echoes are really interesting here about both of them being from Normandy. And I like the resonance there of each of them as being revolutionary in his or her own way. Gustave Flaubert had a couple of different male friends that he was very, very close with, one of whom he is the dedicatee, if that's a word, of Madame Bovary. But he also had kind of a love affair with Louise Collet, and we're very happy that he did. It was over a long, long period of time, although geographically they were separated for most of it. We're also happy about that because this love affair that he was having in this very intimate relationship with her, and the fact that she was far away, means that Flaubert, who would write from sort of noon all the way, he would sleep until noon and then write, I think, from the afternoon all the way until the wee hours of the morning. And then generally he would write a letter to Louise. So we have a lot of information about the composition and about the writing process, which is super revealing and also very entertaining. The letters that the two of them write back and forth are really pretty incredible. Okay, so now that we have discussed those two things, we're actually going to dive on into the text. So we're gonna use today, this whole time, all three sessions, the Lydia Davis translation. I also have, in the end, when we talk about translation, I have the Stiegmüller, and then I also have two French versions that we're gonna take a look at. But this is, I think, the most, it's the most interesting and feels in lots of ways like the most modern and frankly the most funny and entertaining and kind of real and more true, I think, to the text, as much as I am a judge of that, than some of the other translations, which tended to be much looser and made the prose much smoother, or omitted things, or made it much more flowery. So Lydia Davis is known for being excellent at translation. Obviously, she's translating Proust and Flaubert, but she's also known for being very true to the spirit of the language, but also to the syntax. So we're gonna dive on in. I love this cover art. To me, it doesn't actually speak that much. This is not the image in my mind that I had of Emma, but I love it nonetheless. It's very evocative and beautiful in lots of ways. And the fact that the title of the book is Madame Bovary is very interesting in lots of ways. So if we turn to this title page here, we find something interesting, which is it says Madame Bovary Provincial Ways. So there is a subtitle here with this title, which is interesting because no one talks about the subtitle. It's not, people refer to the novel as Madame Bovary. Almost never do you have Madame Bovary, Provincial Ways. So I looked at my, I got down my French versions, and my maxi poche, like my kind of more pulpy, airporty version of Madame Bovary in French, does not, in fact, have anything about, it just says Madame Bovary on the title page. The Gallimard, which is the kind of more hoity-toity of my French versions, it does. And interestingly, it is called Mort du Provence. I'm sorry, du Provence. Here you can see. So it's like the Moors, meaning like the customs. So it's customs of the province, not Provence, which is what I just said in French. Sorry, that was a mispronunciation. It's Mort de Provence. I think that's like a decent pronunciation. But it means it's like the one of the translations is manners of province or provincial manners. And I like the fact that that Lydia Davis is kind of expanding it a little bit, because the mores of a community, meaning, they're not just their manners. It's not just about etiquette. It's about kind of the ways of the people. She is getting a little more to that, I think, with provincial ways. And importantly, this is not Provençal ways. It's talking about the province, in this case of Normandy, but province in the sense of provincial, not in the sense of the south of France specifically. So it's interesting because we're looking at Madame Bovary as an example, or sort of a beacon, or an embodiment of provincial life. And the reason why that's important in part is because Flaubert, with this realism that he's sort of the pioneer of, is working against some of this, the 18th century Enlightenment, and then a lot of the Romanticism that came just before realism. So the Romantics, there was a lot more poetry written, a lot more long odes, not so many novels. There were some, certainly, but they would have been more Gothic novels. They would have been more concerned about death and beauty and the sublime, and it would have been sort of you think of like Frankenstein, or you think of something that's a little more fantastical too. This is very rooted not in the story of a monster or the story of a great love affair, although it's the story of many mediocre love affairs, but it's very much it's more grounded. It's more about the provinces. So I actually think it's really noteworthy and cool to notice. I like the fact that Lydia Davis included it, and I like her translation. The English translations before usually said provincial manners or the manners of the provinces. I like provincial ways better. Okay, then we're going to move along a bit here. I love her introduction. As usual, totally no nonsense. I mostly skipped the chronology. Oh! But we can check here, and we can see that I was, in fact, correct. 1821, the birth of Gustave Flaubert. So, and then we're going to move right through the chronology, not too worried about that, to this. There's a first dedication and then a second dedication. So the first dedication is to Marie-Antoine Jules Sénard. And importantly, this was the guy who was the lawyer who... essentially, when Flaubert's novel came out, it was they were going to ban it, and the French government freaked out, and everybody freaked out because it was about a woman who was an adulterer. Never mind the fact that she does not come to a happy ending. Again, sorry for the spoilers. I'm assuming most people, even if you haven't finished the book, know that things don't go super great for our poor Emma. But I love the middle of this here because not only did Sénard do such a good job in defending the book, and in fact, also the prosecution did not do a great job because they basically upheld. I did a lot of research into this, into the trial. They did all of this stuff about how amazing the book was and how incredible the prose was and how people were going to really want to read this book And then the book was going to be, harmful for people because it's about a woman who has a lot of passion. So that backfired for them in some ways because then the book became wildly popular. So it reads right here, by its inclusion in your magnificent presentation of my case, this work of mine has acquired for me an unforeseen authority. So as the saying goes, all publicity is good publicity. In lots of ways, this trial, not only because the prosecution was upholding the incredible prose. It also just the notoriety of having been brought up on charges of obscenity. Always good for a couple of readers. And in fact, in Flaubert's case, it was very helpful. The whole trial. Then Louise Boulet is one of these. Maxime Duchamp is another one. These are very, very close friends of Flaubert's who read, constantly were reading his work. They would come over a lot and he would read his work aloud to them, and he really valued their support and their perspectives on what he was doing. Okay, we're finally going to dive into the book. Part one, here we are. There are 3 different parts. And we're going to dive into the first of them here, right at the top. We were in study hall when the headmaster entered, followed by a new boy, dressed in regular clothes and a school servant carrying a large desk. Those who were sleeping woke up, and everyone rose as though taken by surprise while at work. There's so much important stuff that's happening. And any of you who feel like one of the reasons why you want to tune in is to become a better reader or to have a richer experience, my best piece of advice is simply to pay attention. Not only to things like the title, and you can do some sleuthing and figure out what's happening with dedications, but oftentimes the first paragraph is really important in the sense of setting the tone and of really, it's sort of a lot of signposts as to what might be most important in the work in your hands. Okay, we're going to take a look at this. So we were in study hall. It's really important here right from the start to know that we are talking about a collective. So in this case, it's a collective of students. It's interesting to me that it's beginning with this very sort of bourgeois image of these young boys in school. This would have been a provincial school again, and this is not a super serious place because we see that, in fact, most of the boys in the study hall are sleeping. But you have this sense right away of a collective. And there is a sense that Madame Bovary in some ways is unique and is not, in fact, the same. She has much more passion and she has much more drive and a little more materialistic greed than some of her cohort. And yet this book, it really is very much about the entire town. It's about the entire community. It's about an entire social class, this petit bourgeoisie. So right from the start, we have this idea of this collective. And then I love that they're in study hall. They're not in arithmetic classes. They're not in religion. They're not in, they're not studying French literature. They're in study hall. So we're looking right straight into the school. And yet what's happening in the school is not anything. Nothing is happening. Nothing is being taught. These are boys who a lot of them are sleeping. Maybe some of them are doing something. But we do not get the sense that there is a lot of rigor, which is important because Charles Bovary is a doctor, but he's actually not even a doctor. And a lot is made of this in a book I'm going to mention later called Charles Bovary, Country Doctor. Because he's someone he's more like a physician's assistant, I think is what we would say these days. He has a certificate as a health officer, but he is not, in fact, a doctor. So there's all this kind of pretension and there's all of this kind of mystique about, social class and being a doctor and being educated. And yet Charles is not going to receive great education. The first time he sits for his test, he bombs the whole thing and has to take it again. So, but here we are, we get a sense of this from the jump because they're not in any sort of rigorous science class here. They are in fact, a study hall. Importantly, so the headmaster entered. So right away, also we're talking about hierarchy. So there's a very, very clear sense we have this headmaster who's in charge of the whole thing. It's very patriarchal. It's very male. And this headmaster is coming in. So you have like this kind of layer of pretension and this layer of hierarchy that sits on top of the fact that nothing is happening really in the classroom. He's followed by a new boy. And interestingly, so the italics, some translators have the italics and some French versions have the italics and some do not. So the italics were Flaubert's, that should be understood here because it's not telling us otherwise. They were his in the sense that he was underlining this as he was writing with his quill pen. Apparently he did not like steel nibs. He wrote with an actual, feather, and it was very tortured. And he wrote like 4,500 pages in order to get the several hundred that we have here. He was a huge, writer and then rewriter and scribbler and all of that. But this idea of this new boy is important because lots of times when you have the italics, there's a certain irony and a certain sort of teasing that's kind of inherent there. And it's an important note because you're meant to see this nouveau, this new boy, as being, there's already sort of fun being made of him. It's a little bit of a jest here. So he is wearing regular clothes. He's always an outsider. Poor Dr. Bovary, poor Charles he's always on the outside, and he's never quite sure what's going on around him. And then the last part of it here, of course, you have all the boys who are sleeping. Everyone rose as though taken by surprise while at work. So this idea of it's as if they were taken by surprise at work, and yet, in fact, I think the idea here is that they were not, in fact, working very hard. Okay, so, and very quickly, I want to just look at the structure of this very first part, and then we will close today's section. So, not sort of one page later, we have this chunk here that says, thanks no doubt to this willingness he displayed, he did not have to go down into the lower class. For while he knew his rules passably well, he had almost no elegance in his constructions. It was the curé of his village who had started him on Latin, his parents, for reasons of economy, having delayed as long as possible sending him to school. His father, Monsieur Charles Denis Bartholomé Bovary, a former assistant army surgeon, compromised in about 1812 in some business involving conscription and forced at about that time to leave the service, had then profited from his personal attributes to pick up a dowry of 60,000 francs presented in the form of a hosier's daughter. So there is so much work. So in the beginning of this, 1 page ago, we have Charles who is having his, he's being introduced as a student walking into a school. And yet, literally, a page and a half later, we have his full family history. His father, there's a little sort of ignominy here. We have this little, this idea that he was an army surgeon, and yet, something terrible happened. He was compromised in 1812. I think that's where I got the year 1812, in some business involving conscription. So so right away we're getting this whole story, this whole background of Charles Bovary. And it's not a very honorable story that we are getting. We also find out that his parents really need to be economical. And what is introduced right here on the 3rd page of the novel is this idea of the bourgeois marriage as being very, it's a transaction. It's very transactional, and it's very sort of commerce-based. Like, he needed the money, so he secured a wife who had a dowry. And the importance of that is that Emma Bovary, who grew up in a convent and read nothing but all of these romance novels, really wanted a love marriage. And she's a woman who has tons and tons of passion. And yet we know from the start that the marriages, not just this one, but the next one we're going to take a look at, they all have to do with money. They are all economic arrangements. In the middle of the 19th century, marriage was in fact very much, an economic proposition. Okay, so we're going to move on, and very quickly, let's see, on page 10, so this is, 4 or 5 pages later, we have a very quick sort of review of what happens with Charles. So we didn't spend a whole lot of time looking at a big, long first paragraph. What we're looking at here is how quickly in this very first 10 pages, we cover so much territory. I think a lot of readers forget that we first see Charles in that classroom because we think of the book as about being about Madame Bovary. So one of the things, too, to recognize is that the title of the book is Madame Bovary. Everyone in their mind thinks it is referring to Emma Bovary, but there are actually 3 Madame Bovarys. We, of course, have the very first Madame Bovary, who is his mother, And then we have the second Madame Bovary, who is his wife. And then we have the third Madame Bovary, who is his second wife. So we are going to continue in the second part. We're going to talk a little bit more about these wives and about these powerful women. In the second part, we're also going to talk about realism and the free and direct style. And of course, in the midst of all of that discussion, we will be talking about Flaubert's exceptional prose and why this novel is in fact worth reading. So thank you for joining me for the first session, and I look forward to seeing you for the second and third. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion of Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. So today, in the second portion of this lecture, we're going to be talking about realism and free indirect style, which both sound really boring, but in fact will not be boring. If in the background you are hearing just a very pleasant, soothing snoring sound, that is at least 2 of the 4 dogs that are in my office with me here today. And if you hear the sound of rain drumming on the roof, that is in fact the sound of rain drumming on the roof, which I really love because it's giving me a very Normandy kind of feel. It's very cloudy and stormy today in California, which seems absolutely perfect for a discussion of a book that is set in the north of France, where it is often, in fact, chilly and a little blustery and gray and rainy. Okay, we're going to dive in today and take a look at realism. So realism is one of these literary schools, and again, Flaubert was not wild about being put into this category. And he's not the only French guy. I mean, there was also Balzac, there's Stendhal, there are a bunch of people who came slightly before him. But really, Madame Bovary is known as being sort of the masterpiece of French realism. So you want to look at these things in context. And in the 1700s, we have, of course, the Age of Reason. We have the Enlightenment. We have this real investment of cultural capital in the idea of science and things being reasonable and things being, quantifiable. And so you have that you have a body of literature that's a lot of essays and a lot of things that are very based in the scientific and not a lot of, expansive novel type things. In reaction, because all of these literary schools, not all of them, but often they will be in reaction to the one right before. In reaction to the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, we have this surge. We have a surge of Romanticism. So at the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, you have this Romanticism. You think of the Romantic poets. In England, you think of the sublime, and you think of nature, and there's a huge preoccupation with death and romantic love, but also the fleeting nature of time and the desperation in the human condition. So you have this romantic literature, which is very sort of overblown in lots of ways, and there's a lot of hearkening back to the classics and a sort of a passionate description of things that tends to feel a bit high flown, and in fact often is in the shape of an ode or an epic. So there's even a sort of convoluted package that this Romanticism is coming in. So in reaction to Romanticism, you have this school of literature called Realism. And it is exactly what its name says. It's trying to get at something that is real. It's trying to get at the real world, not a scientific world, but the real world as it is perceived by, normal, everyday men and women. You think about this from the 1840s on. Again, those were sort of, you have Stendhal and Balzac. And again, Madame Bovary is in 1857. So it's a bit later than some of the realism that came before it. But it is also, again, often thought of as the masterpiece of realist literature. After realist literature, we have something called naturalist naturalism. So you have like Émile Zola, which is where you're pushing realism a little further into like even sort of grittier detail, and it takes on a little bit more of a political flavor. So with realism, again, there's this idea that you're getting to something real. So there's this idea of truth. I always bridle a bit at the idea of any literary truth because truths are so slippery in any form. But when the way that Flaubert is mostly getting to this quote unquote truth is through the idea of sort of mundane, banal, kind of everyday details about mundane, banal, everyday people. So in lots of ways, the realist literary movement was very democratizing. So we're talking suddenly about bakers and hosiers and small country doctors. We're not talking only here about the courtiers and the royalty and the huge thinkers and the essayists. We're talking about sort of every man and every woman. Turns out to be a lot more about or written by every man and less by every woman. But there was a democratizing sort of everyday person who was brought to the fore. So, and in fact, it becomes, especially with Madame Bovary, it becomes very much about the middle class. So not only is it democratizing, but there's a class thing where you have this elevation of the bourgeoisie, the middle class. And not only are we looking at the life of a baker, but you're looking at the details of that life. So you're looking at what someone's eating, the fabrics that they're wearing, how much they're sweating. There's a lot of involvement of the body. So instead of just talking about someone in metaphors the way you might have in romantic literature, suddenly now things are getting real in realism. So you also one of the things that Flaubert is most famous for is this almost sort of clinical approach to what he's doing, in that his selection of details are presented sort of objectively. So he's presenting these details to us. There's this enormous accumulation of detail, but the author is kind of omnipresent in the sense that the author is always there, and they are the ones who are choosing, and it's very sort of telling. It's third person. This is someone, this omniscient, but also very invisible author is providing these details for us without any kind of commentary. And it's this very sort of godlike hand that the author has, which is interesting because it is omnipotent. It's able, this narrative style is able to kind of move in and out of all of the different characters' consciousnesses, if that's the word, and is again is very sort of present in some ways, but also invisible. This is not someone who is moralizing. This is not someone who is giving commentary. People are allowed to speak for themselves in these circumstances. Characters have their own dialects, their own tones. There's a lot of quoting that's happening. So all of this accumulation of detail in this very sort of clinical, way where it's not commented upon, simply shown to the reader, is kind of, those are sort of the hallmarks of realism. Okay, so as always, Lydia Davis has some very smart things to say, and in this case, it is about realism. So we're going to look very briefly here in the introduction on page 15. So this is a little exercise for some of you in Roman numerals. You've got those tiny little Roman numerals here. So this is what Lydia Davis, who's such a genius, has to say. In place of the author's comments, then, the details of the scenes and the cute physical portraits must convey everything. And for Flaubert, direct dialogue, too, functioned to portray the characters more than to move the plot forward. Detailed description would bring the reader into the presence of the material. To be effective, the details must be closely observed, carefully chosen, precise, and vivid. So those of you who have listened to or attended the lecture on Cassandra at the Wedding, that is a novel written in 1962 by a woman who grew up in California about a setting in California. And yet that is an example of a work where the details are absolutely just incredibly, incredibly well chosen. It's one of those books very much like Madame Bovary, and honestly, this is like the only thing that these two books share. There really is this sense of details as speaking volumes and doing lots of hard work. Okay, so we're now going to take a look at, as promised, we're going to take a look at some of the women in the very beginning of the book. So we're going to turn to page 10. So on page 10, in part one, we left off with the three Madame Bovarys. So there's Madame Bovary, who is Charles's mother. There is Madame Bovary, who is Charles's first wife. And then we have Emma Bovary, who is certainly the one who is, she's sort of the biggest presence in the novel. But if we look on page 10, here we're looking at these bottom blocks of text. So again, what we're looking at here are these details. So take a listen to these details. Charles therefore set to work again. So this is after he has failed his exams. Charles therefore set to work again and prepared unremittingly the subjects for his examination, for which he learned all the questions by heart in advance. He passed with a fairly good grade. What a great day for his mother. They put on a grand dinner. And then a little bit lower down. But it was not enough to have raised her son, seen to it that he got his medical training and discovered toast for his practice. He needed a wife. She found him one, a bailiff's widow from Dieppe, who was 45 years old with an income of 1,200 livres. Although she was ugly, thin as a lathe, as thick with pimples as the spring is with buds, Madame Dubuc certainly had no lack of suitors to choose from. To achieve her ends, Mère Bovary was obliged to supplant them all, and she very skillfully foiled even the intrigues of a pork butcher favored by the clergy. Okay, so we're going to take a quick look here. So we have some details that we're going to look at in a minute about Charles's preparation. But what we have here is this idea of exactly how he went about the preparation. He learned all of the questions by heart in advance, which is an interesting way. I mean, this is something that he is learning by rote. And in some ways, there's this real criticism being leveled by Flaubert. This is not the Age of Reason where he's doing lots and lots of thinking. This is not Montaigne or Voltaire doing some kind of, amazing essayistic rhetoric stuff. This is simply someone memorizing what he needs to know. And he passed with a fairly good grade. We don't have an exact detail there. Maybe, in fact, maybe in the French it even is. Maybe I'll take a look at that. But you have this idea of him passing with this kind of mediocre thing. And again, this is the second time he's passed. What a great day for his mother. So when we are looking at the details surrounding these two women, in this case, in the beginning, we're just thinking about the first two Madame Bovarys. They have this real power. So there is this sense here, what a great day for his mother, which is so funny because it really ought to be a great day for Charles. And yet the emphasis here is on his mother. And then they put on a grand dinner. So again, this is how they're celebrating, but the way that they're celebrating is this very sort of bourgeois. When they say a grand dinner, you can imagine, given everything that we have learned about these people until this point, that in fact a grand dinner, this is not some, Downton Abbey moment. This is very much like a more provincial moment. And then down a little bit more, we really get into some more details here. We have this idea of having discovered toast for his practice. Again, this is a very provincial setting. It's like, I don't know what the equivalent would be near you, but something, it's not like New York City. This is a small town that she's very proud to have gotten him situated in. And the fact that the wife is a bailiff's widow from Dieppe, it's not a judge, it's not a solicitor or an attorney. It is in fact the bailiff, and it's the bailiff's widow. She was 45 years old and an income of 1,200 livres. So again, there is this idea of marriage as being this entirely economic proposition. Then we have this incredible description. Although she was ugly, thin as a lathe, as thick with pimples as the spring is with buds, Madame Dubuc certainly had no lack of suitors to choose from. So Flaubert is doing this incredible thing here where he's fairly sparing with his metaphors, but we have this metaphor that's so amazing because She's as thick with pimples as the spring is with buds. So this is a woman who's 45 years old, and talk about an economic proposition. This is strictly a money thing that's happening, because presumably not a lot of babies are going to be born to a 45-year-old woman in 1857, or in the a little earlier than that, when Flaubert was writing this story. But again, to then have her pimples as being like, the pimples alone are a really striking detail, because again, this is an older woman. She's still, fighting acne. She's got some serious adult acne happening. And then to have it, to choose the detail, the metaphor be the buds in spring, there's this very sort of cliche romantic thing. And so here we have Flaubert, the realist, who's pushing against romanticism. The spring buds as sort of this incredibly cliche romantic metaphor here is being turned on its head, because what we are talking about are pimples. So you have this choice of detail that is very realist, in that it's doing a lot of work. It's telling us a lot about Madame Dubuc, the widow of the bailiff, but it also is pushing against this romantic thing. And then when she, she's fighting against all of these suitors, so we again have this real strength in the form of Madame Bovary, of Charles's mother, and yet she's skillfully foiled even the intrigues of a pork butcher favored by the clergy. So this is one of those details, and when we discuss irony in the third part, you're going to get an even stronger sense of this kind of irony, where Flaubert chooses something that's kind of, he's building things up, and then he hits us with this very, very mundane, not to say kind of grotesque or absurd detail. So someone who would have been supported by the clergy, you would expect to have been someone, in a slightly higher standing than a pork butcher. And there's something, too, about the pork butcher, that detail there. It's not just any butcher, and it's not just a tradesman. It's a pork butcher. So there's this real sense of giving us very concrete details that speak volumes about our the social milieu and the importance of this actual world that we are entering so completely, because in fact we have all of these details. And importantly, Flaubert is not saying like some lame pork butcher, and he's not saying like the downtrodden pork butcher. This is not Charles Dickens, where we have lots of commentary about ailing so-and-so, or, poor old so-and-so. It's given to us, it's simply a pork butcher who was supported by the clergy. And it's simply an ugly woman who is very thin, who has pimples. So it's not, one of the important things here to realize is there isn't commentary, and we don't have a lot of qualifiers. We don't have a lot of the author and the narrator sort of coloring these images. They are simply giving us the details. Okay, and I also wanted to look at page 17 briefly. Another example here. Okay, so this is when they find out, in fact, that Madame Dubuc is she's the widow of the bailiff from Dieppe. She is not in fact who she says she is. So they think that she has that income. She has some money. Turns out she was lying. So a couple of details that are very important here on page 17. One is that we find out that Madame Dubuc's first name is Heloise, and Heloise is a very important 12th century nun who had this incredibly passionate love affair with this, I believe he was a priest. His name was Abelard. So Abelard and Heloise, it's kind of like a Romeo and Juliet thing in French literature, but it's medieval. So it's 500 years before we have the publication of Macbeth, or the production of Macbeth, but it's so in the 1100s we have this nun and this her lover, and it's this huge scandalous thing, but it's about the power of love, and they end up having this sort of physical romance, and it ends up being kind of this very passionate thing between these members of the clergy, which it clearly, not a lot more, not a bigger statement on passion than the idea of two people who have renounced their physical lives. I mean, that's really some kind of passion. But what we find out here, and this is of course the irony, is that Eloise Dubuc, the widow of this bailiff from Dieppe, this is her namesake. Her namesake is this passionate, and Eloise was also very erudite. She was very important in her community. This Eloise here is old. She's pimply. She has no money. This is not someone who is, going to be held up as sort of our modern day realism Juliet figure. So that is a detail that, again, there's no commentary about it. There's not any sort of qualifiers. It's simply that is what her name is, and yet that one small detail is speaking volumes about who this woman is. I love the specificity here too of this. It's kind of close to the bottom here. So this is Monsieur Bovary. This is Charles' dad freaking out. In his anger, the elder Monsieur Bovary, breaking a chair on the flagstones, accused his wife of having brought calamity down upon their son by hitching him to an old nag whose harness wasn't worth her skin. They came to toasts. They had it out. There were scenes. Eloise, in tears, throwing herself into her husband's arms, begged him to defend her from his parents. Charles tried to speak up for her. His parents became furious and they left. I love the level of detail here because we see, again, the power of Charles's mother having brokered this marriage that in fact turns out to be a bust. And again, Flaubert was really sort of outspoken about how he didn't use a lot of metaphors because he was simply going to promote or provide us these details. And yet he does, when he uses the metaphors, they are just excellent. Like this one, brought down calamity upon their son by hitching him to an old nag whose harness wasn't worth her skin. So again, you can't get more sort of bourgeois and more sort of, like lower middle class here, petit bourgeois, with this idea of this old nag. I also love the fact here that Charles's father is having this big outburst, but in fact is totally ineffectual. And Charles is trying to speak up, and yet his parents just sort of continue their freaking out and they leave. So you always, at every turn, poor Charles is just not getting it done. The guy is just so mediocre in so many ways. And even as he's trying to defend, his wife, who is in fact a fraud, he's working very hard to do that. And yet he is not in fact successful. Okay. So that's sort of our discussion of realism, and we're going to move on to another very distinctive feature of Flaubert. The realism lends itself very well to this, which is something called the free indirect style. So basically, this is this very cool narrative technique where we have this omniscient, godlike narrator who is able to enter into the consciousnesses, if that's a word, of all of the characters. So, it's someone who's able to tell us exactly what all of these people are thinking in very quick succession. And lots of times it follows the realist credo in the sense that their thoughts and feelings are being simply reported, and oftentimes in their own language, in a way that's very effective without a lot of commentary on the part of the narrator. So again, we're going to take a listen to what our incredibly brilliant Lydia Davis has to say about the free indirect discourse. So here on page 18, Lydia Davis says, Flaubert, entering fully always into his characters' points of view, shifts gears convincingly as he moves in and out of these other styles, no less alien to him, perhaps, than the style of the narration of the book as a whole. So again, in the past, some of you have heard me talk about these different registers that a novel might be written in. And Flaubert has a very, very good grip on all the sort of different registers, all these different dictions and all of the different sort of dialects. And in order to show us this very, very complete world, then obviously their own voices and their own descriptions of things are an important facet of that. So in order to look at that, we're going to go to page 168. And this is interesting because, again, even well into the novel, Mère Bovary, Charles's mother, is still really a pretty serious influence and a pretty strong presence. She's not a main player at this point, and yet she still does make herself felt. So on page 168 here, we're going to start at the top. So what we're going to look quickly at here is the way that our narrator is entering into the different, the consciousness of each of these people. First, we have him in Rodolphe's mind, Rodolphe being one of Emma's lovers. Then we're going to move into Emma's mind, and then Madame Bovary's, and then, meaning Emma Bovary's, and then, Emma, and then Madame Bovary, mère. And then we're going to look at the way that Flaubert can kind of toggle back and forth between these two women. So Rodolphe is thinking up at the top here. He made her into something compliant and corrupt. Hers was a sort of idiotic attachment, full of admiration for him, of sensual pleasure for her, a bliss that numbed her, and her soul sank into this intoxication and drowned in it. So you have this idea, so when, for example, when Rodolphe is saying a sort of idiotic attachment, that idiotic attachment is very much how Rodolphe himself would be thinking about her. Full of admiration for him, of sensual pleasure for her, a bliss that numbed her, and her soul sank into this intoxication. So this is all what Rodolphe is thinking. Emma herself would not think about herself in those terms, and yet this is exactly the way that Rodolphe we're inside his brain getting his description of how Emma feels about him. And then a little further down here, we have Emma herself thinking, at last, so this is when she's getting out of the carriage of his she's gotten very brazen here, and she's gone off for a walk with him. She comes back and she is stepping out of her hirondelle, out of the carriage. At last, those who had still doubted no longer did so when they saw her step down from the hirondelle one day with her waist tightly buttoned up in a vest like a man. So we have this idea of Emma. This is exactly how Emma herself would conceive of it, that people who used to think that she was not that cool are now, those who had still doubted her no longer did so. So you have this idea of this is the way that she would in fact conceive of it. Then we move on to the next one, Madame Bovary Senior. Madame Bovary Senior, who, after a dreadful scene with her husband, had come to take refuge in her son's home, was as scandalized as any of the townswomen. Many other things displeased her. First of all, Charles had not listened to her advice about forbidding novels. Then, she did not like the way the house was run. So again, we have this realism that's pushing against the romanticism here. Emma Bovary, like the root cause of a lot of her issues is her obsession with the romantic novel. With exactly, not necessarily the medieval one about Eloise and Abelard, but all of the romantic ones that came at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. So Charles's mother is like, do not let that woman read those books, in much the same way you might think, that kids these days are being corrupted by TikTok or whatever the thing is. So, and Charles is not, of course, strong enough or decisive enough to tell Emma that she cannot read her books. And we also have this idea of Emma as failing to keep the house the way it should be kept, all of that sort of thing. So when you have Emma alighting from the carriage and you have this sense of her feeling so satisfied because people are now going to have to recognize her as the kind of, she has arrived socially. And then we immediately in the same paragraph, we are in Charles's mother's head. So it's not even a new paragraph. And we know that she's had this disastrous conflict with her husband. And again, that this dreadful scene with her husband, that kind of language and the description of that interaction is very much the way that she, Madame Bovary the elder, would be thinking about that. Okay, so yes, okay, great. So when we are talking about realism and free indirect style, these are some of the real hallmarks of what make Flaubert's masterpiece such an important piece of literature, because before this, again, with these the novels or the essays and whatnot of the Enlightenment, and then the poetry and the novels from the Romantic period, this is an entirely different delving into a world that is very kind of lower middle class, and it's people who are working people, and it's not a doctor. In fact, he's like a country physician's assistant who is marrying these women who are, you know, the widows of bailiffs, and the farmer's daughter who's been brought up in the nunnery reading romance novels. So you have this sense of this real world, quote unquote real world, and this idea that Flaubert is really trying to get us to some sort of truth. And when you think about, you know, the French Revolution is not having been that far beforehand. I mean, it's within, what is it, 1786? Oh my God, that's so embarrassing. Is that right? Maybe. So, you know, regardless, it's end of the 18th century. You know, it's only sort of, what, 65 years later, 70 years later, that we are talking about something that is very revolutionary, because in fact it is this delving and this exploration of the middle class. So I hope that makes you have a good sense of why this book is important to read. Not only is it just sort of delightful to immerse ourselves in this world, but in fact, it's a very radical political thing that Flaubert is doing. So please join us for part 3. Time flies, you guys. I just am never fully satisfied with what I get to fit into these half-hour sessions. But in the 3rd session, we're going to talk about irony and pathos, which are very important. The irony in the novel, again, I love dark humor, whether it's in television or literature. And in lots of ways, I think the irony of Flaubert, sometimes because we don't understand the cultural reference, but sometimes just because of the way it's been translated, or the way that we approach a classic, I think sometimes we don't appreciate that. So tune in to the 3rd session to learn about the irony in Flaubert, and also the pathos, the kind of the sympathy that Flaubert is always trying to evoke in his readers. So thank you very much for having joined the 2nd session, and I hope to see you for the 3rd. Hi, everybody. Welcome to part 3 of our discussion of Lydia Davis's amazing translation of Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Today, we're going to finish up by talking about irony, and how that irony, there's a lot of irony in Flaubert, but also how that irony is always intertwined with lots of pathos. So we're going to discuss those aspects of the novel. Then we're going to talk a little bit about plot. I don't ever spend really very much time on plot, partially because plot doesn't interest me very much. Occasionally I'll look at plot if it's really interesting structurally, or if there's something kind of unusual about it. But plot in general is not something that I pay a lot of attention to. It's also something that you can very easily access on Wikipedia, so no need for me to tell you what happens in the story. And then finally, we're going to look at the close of the novel. Okay, we're going to dive right in. As always, when we are looking at Madame Bovary and this translation in particular, we're going to take a look at what Lydia Davis has to say. So if we go to, let's see, page 6 of the introduction, as always, it's a little bit of a Roman numeral, a baby Roman numeral test for people. On page 6 here, she says this: if objective description was Flaubert's literary method, that objectivity was always imbued with irony. To see and judge a thing with a cool eye was to judge it with the irony that had been part of his nature since he was a child. So there's I like the idea of describing something in a cool tone. There is this sense that there's a little bit of mockery that comes with the distance and with the coolness, and also, of course, with the selection of details, which we talked about in part 2 of this discussion. Okay, and then she has this excellent, very quick analysis of where we see some of that irony. It is present in his choice of names. The old rattletrap of a coach called Swallow, the hirondelle. The many character names, such as Bovary itself, that are variations on the French for ox. The evil money lender, l'heureux, who is also known as the happy one. So there are lots of them, like Tuvache, who is the mayor. Like if you say that in French, it's like all cow. You know, it's that kind of a thing. There's a lot of ironic names. I mean, we could talk for 90 minutes about names alone, but there's also irony in other bits and pieces. Okay, so, and then in fact, we're going to read one more chunk of the Lydia Davis down here about the irony. Flaubert's irony is present in the eloquent juxtapositions he creates between the poetic and the brutally commonplace, with an effect that is sometimes humorous, sometimes shocking, but that always draws us up short, breaks the mood. An exquisite passage, often a description of nature, will be undercut, as though here Flaubert is also undercutting his own lyrical impulse by what immediately follows, a banal, mundane comparison or action. Okay, so we are going to look exactly at that. So let's turn to page 227. So this is when Emma, let's see, I'm getting us to 227 here. So Emma has with her passion and her guile and her kind of sneakiness, she has somehow convinced Charles, her husband Charles, that she is the one who needs to go into town and have this interaction with Léon. So if we look on page 227 here, she basically has what amounts to sort of like a 3-day honeymoon with Léon in town while she's supposedly running this important errand for her husband. So I want you to pay attention as I'm reading to the way that there is sort of this buildup of all of these beautiful romantic notions and then how they are undercut. They were 3 full, exquisite, splendid days, a real honeymoon. I mean, 3 full, exquisite, splendid days. Exquisite and splendid, I think, are a bit over the top. So you have this kind of buildup of the romantic. They stayed at the Hôtel de Boulogne on the harbor, and there they lived with the shutters closed and the doors locked, flowers on the floor and fruit drinks on ice, which were brought up to them from the morning on. Toward evening, they would hire a covered boat and go have dinner on an island. So all of that does sound very idyllic. I have a feeling that the flowers on the floor, I'm imagining a big bouquet maybe sitting in front of a fireplace or something. I imagine that, and the fruit drinks on ice. I don't know those references, but I would imagine those are things that are fairly provincial, not that sophisticated. But, you know, going on a covered boat out to an island for a romantic dinner, of course, does sound very romantic. It was the hour when, from along the docksides, one can hear the echo of the caulkers' mallets striking the hulls of the ship. Smoke from the tar would rise from between the trees, and on the river one saw broad patches of oil undulating unevenly beneath the crimson glow of the sun like floating sheets of Florentine bronze. So I love this so much when you have these, the caulkers mallets. So you're expecting more of this kind of idyllic, bucolic, beautiful, romantic thing. It was the hour when one can hear the echo of the caulkers mallets striking the hulls of the ships. A caulker's mallet is, they're applying caulk to the hull of these ships. There's a nice kind of onomatopoeia here with the caulker's mallet, but it's sort of this. The idea is that it would be this romantic thing, and yet it's obviously something that is very kind of working class. And then smoke from the tar would rise. I mean, if you've ever been behind someone who is doing the tar for asphalt, you know that is not a great scent. So, you have this romantic moment, and yet, just as Lydia Davis is suggesting, it is undercut by the scent of the scent of the tar. And on the river, one saw broad patches of oil undulating unevenly. What I love about that is undulating unevenly has this really beautiful, again, it's almost like an onomatopoeia here. It's this beautiful mimetic thing where we can kind of see the undulations of the water, the undulating unevenly. There's a nice way that the language here is echoing what we are supposed to be envisioning, and yet what we are envisioning is oil slicked onto water, which is, a beautiful mix of this kind of gross industrial waste that is happening, that's also sort of transformed into this beautiful thing. And you could argue that, yes, this is a beautiful transformation, but I think with things like the Kulker's mallet and the scent of the tar, we are supposed to understand that he's doing exactly this ironic thing where you're building, this kind of this very romantic scene of this honeymoon, and yet it's totally undercutting with some of the more kind of industrial details. Also, when I keep mentioning the word romantic, I have to remind myself, and you potentially, that this also is, again, the way that realism is pushing against romanticism. This is not some like ode on a Grecian urn moment. This is very, very down to earth. And these details that Flaubert is choosing are really, pushing against this idea of the world as being very real in the sense as, not smelling great. Okay. So what I like, though, is that irony, you can have satire, for example, which is irony that has sort of a biting or like an overly moralistic tone. But what we have here with this irony is a totally different animal. What we have here is irony that is really well mixed with pathos. So pathos is simply a Greek word for any kind of sentiment that is meant to evoke pity or sorrow or sympathy for someone. And there is a lot of sympathy that is generated, not just for Charles, but certainly, for the poor young working guy who has his leg reconstructed, and for all of the different people who are really struggling in lots of ways in this book. Okay, but so we're going to take a quick look back to our trusty Lydia Davis introduction on, what is that, page 14 in the introduction. And right up here at the top of the page, Davis says, oh, yeah, sorry. I had a little pause there because I was feeling like that is not the right thing, but it is. So this is Flaubert talking. This will be the first time, I think, that one will see a book that makes fun of its young leading lady and its young leading man. So that was Flaubert writing in, quoted by Davis, but writing in a letter to Boileau, who is the person to whom he is dedicating this book. He goes on, though, Flaubert does, to say that irony takes nothing away from pathos. So he is very clearly stating that both irony and pathos are present. And then Nabokov, who was fascinated with Madame Bovary and has an entire essay on it that is collected in his notes on the novel. Nabokov himself, in his lecture on Madame Bovary, says, "The ironic and the pathetic are beautifully intertwined." So there is this nice idea. This is not just snarky meanness. This is irony that is meant to evoke sympathy, which I think is a really interesting combination. So we're going to look at 226. We're sort of back to where we were a second ago, to look at the scene right before we have the honeymooners on their oil-slicked, tar-smelling boating outing. We have the part right before. So basically, this is Emma, who is really being very sneaky and mischievous here. So she says to her husband, basically knowing how he will react, she says, "I don't trust him very much. Notaries have such a bad reputation. We ought to perhaps to consult. We know only, oh, there's no one." And then Charles says, "Unless Léon," replied Charles, who was thinking. So you have this kind of game that Emma Bovary is playing, in which she's sort of saying, "Oh, I wish we knew someone just like my lover who happens to be available to us." And Charles says, "Oh, wait, what about Léon?" meaning your lover. But it was hard to explain matters by letters, so she offered to make the trip. He thanked her, but he would not let her. She insisted. Each tried to outdo the other with considerate attention. At last, she cried out in a tone of affected rebellion, "No, you must let me. I must go." "How good you are," he said, kissing her on the forehead. The very next day, she set off in the Hirondelle for Rouen to consult Monsieur Léon, and she stayed there 3 days. So it's so sad because you have this. I mean, the irony here is a dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is simply when a reader or someone who is sitting in a play, any type of play, if you have information that one of the people in the book or in the play does not have, that's known as dramatic irony. So in this case, we as a reader understand that Emma is being very conniving here, and we understand that poor Charles is not following along here while basically he's being talked into, or he is talking his wife into going off to visit her lover. So there is this sense here of this real pathos that comes with the along with this irony. So fairly early in the book, we have quite a bit of irony that does in fact inspire sympathy for our poor Charles. Up on the top of page 10, fairly early in the novel, again, by page 10, he's already preparing for his medical exams, and we see him in the city, and he is suddenly aware of sensual pleasure, and he's going out to the bars, and he's meeting women and doing all of these things that his repressed self would not have allowed before. So we're up at the top here. Many things that had been repressed in him opened up. He learned songs by heart and sang them to his lady friends. He developed an enthusiasm for Béranger, knew how to make punch, and at last experienced love. So Béranger is like a cheesy kind of a writer. It's like if you had developed a real enthusiasm for like Daniel Steele or something. But again, this is kind of the irony. This is that cool detachment and the very carefully selected detail that Flaubert is using to build the irony here. And then after we have him finally experiencing love and memorizing songs and singing them to his lady friends, owing to this preparatory work, he completely failed his public health officer's examination. It's so funny. So there's this irony here where we have this kind of high-flown, beautiful prose about, all of these adventures he's having and how he's really tapping into this sensual life. And then we have it deflated exactly the way that Lydia Davis suggests we do, by this idea of he completely failed his public health officer's examination. So I love this sentence, owing to this preparatory work. So instead of it's much like starting the book with study hall and having him not be doing anything there. The preparatory work he's undertaking is like visiting bars and drinking a lot and singing. But now he is, so owing to that preparation, he completely failed his exams. They were waiting for him at home that very evening to celebrate his success. So that's the final part of that first paragraph. And again, you have this exclamation mark at the end, and you have this idea that everybody was so excited to celebrate his success, and yet here he had failed his exams. Okay, so we have this idea of irony, and I think it's important to take a look in those cases, both at the fact that those have to do with Charles, because Charles really is, he's a buffoon in every way, right from the start all the way through till the end, but he is someone for whom we have a lot of sympathy. It's why I mentioned that book before, Charles Bovary, Country Doctor, which is such a great book by Jean Amery, although it was written in German first. Don't let the name fool you. But I loved this notion of like really building out why it is that we think of Charles Bovary as being such a buffoon when in fact he was sort of set up to fail largely because of this irony. So it saves it, though. It saves the novel in many ways. If we didn't have sympathy for him, I think that it would just be, there would be too many villains. There'd be too many villains in this long novel. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly about plot, and then we're going to take a look at the end of the novel. So we talked about the fact that the book is called Madame Bovary, and we've talked a lot in the past. We've talked about the fact that there are three, in fact, and most people forget that and focus only on Emma Bovary, who is Charles's second wife. But I think that people assume that the book is all about Emma, and I think that we are meant to focus our attention on her because of the fact that she is the titular title here. She is the person who is carrying the title of the book. But I am also interested in the fact that her trajectory is a tragedy. I mean, this is not a book the sort of formal definition of a tragedy is that it ends with death, and a comedy ends with a wedding. So we definitely are not happily married at the end of this. We are not hopeful. Nobody's pregnant. It's not it's not looking good for the family as a whole. So what we find out during the course of the book is that Emma is not a great mother. At one point, or not at one point, she does have a child. The child's name is Bert, which you would say Bertha, I think. I listened to a podcast. I try to listen to all of the podcasts I can in preparation just to make sure I'm not repeating things. And somebody kept calling her Birth, the daughter named Birth. So probably Bertha would be like a more satisfactory way to describe the daughter. But Emma is not a great mom. Occasionally she likes to dress up her daughter and sort of play at being a mother, but she's far too busy following her passion to really devote herself. Not to mention that, the daughter is often sent off to wet nurses and is not really part of the not part of the family in any meaningful way. Of course, Emma herself was raised in a convent when her mother died. So, you have this kind of precedent set for sending away the daughter who can't be helpful on the farm. So we have this real focus on Emma, but what I find interesting is that the book does begin and end very firmly with our trusty Charles. So in the beginning, we have him as the new boy who is just showing up at the new school, and it's painful and awkward, and he's kind of a loser, and sorry, apologies to you, Charles. But right from the start, he's kind of the butt of jokes, and he's not someone who is going to be a bright light, and that sort of continues apace throughout the entire novel. But we also have the close of the novel, which is fixing on him as well. So we're going to look here at page 310, down at the bottom. At 7 o'clock, little Bert, that sounds so weird. It's not a great name, is it? At 7 o'clock, little Bertha, still not great, little Bertha, who had not seen him all afternoon, came to call him for dinner. His head was leaning back against the wall, his eyes were closed, his mouth was open, and he was holding in his hands a long lock of black hair. Okay, one interesting thing to note here, it's not clear how he dies. He dies of some sort of undescribed illness. Assuming, he has some medical training. So, I don't know if we are meant to think he has died of a broken heart. I'm not sure if we are meant to just accept this as kind of almost like another strike of irony, just meaning like another poking fun at the romantic novel, that of course he would die of heartache at the end of this novel after Emma is gone. It also, the fact that he's holding the long lock of black hair, I have to imagine that was not not a high class savory thing to do. I think it might have been fine to, I don't know, have like a woven bracelet of your love's hair, or like perhaps a piece in a locket. But this idea of a long lock of black hair, it's it's unappealing. It is not appealing. So the fact that he is holding it, on some level there's a certain amount of irony because he seems like a buffoon, but it's also very sweet. Again, we have this sympathy because clearly he still loves her through to the end. "Papa, come," she said. And, thinking that he wanted to play, she pushed him gently. He fell to the ground. He was dead. 36 hours later, at the apothecary's request, Monsieur Canivet came. He opened him and found nothing. So again, we have this, this is such an interesting nuance. So of course, Flaubert's father was a surgeon and his older brother was a surgeon. We also know that Charles's father was this, disgraced army surgeon. So you have this long line of people who are, even in the middle of the 19th century, opening up other people. And you have a real sort of trust in medicine that is gone awry many different times. Charles undergoes, he leads this poor, innocent, young person on this terrible medical, sort of innovation quest that really ends very badly. So we, of course, have an autopsy that's being performed here, and he found nothing. So there is a sense too of opening him up and finding nothing, meaning that Charles is kind of this empty husk of a man. There's like literally nothing in him. He has no guts, no brain, no hearts. Sorry, that was my light, just fell right off the back of my computer. So we have this kind of medical inquiry, and I think we need to look at this too as a sort of pushing back of realism on even the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, and this idea that science is going to tell us everything we need to know. In fact, here it is not solving the mystery of Charles Bovary's death, and it's not even solving the mystery of like what is in him and what makes him tick and who Charles Bovary might be. Okay, when everything was sold, I mean, it's so harsh. We go right straight from this sort of from his death to then 36 hours later, which I love that precision there. It's very kind of medical. And yet the autopsy is unsuccessful. Nothing is found. And then we're sort of all of the process of what would happen next is totally elided. And we've gone right to when everything was sold. So even at the close of the novel, even at this really sort of gut-wrenching moment, we don't have the daughter going into paroxysms of sadness, and we don't have an emotion like laden kind of description. What we have here is again this kind of economic proposition. We have like a mercantile thing happening, a mercenary thing happening here. When everything was sold, there remained 12 francs 75 centimes, which was used to pay Mademoiselle Bovary's fare to her grandmother's house. So again, Mère Bovary, like Charles's mother, is the long-standing one. She is the Mrs. Bovary, the Madame Bovary, who is outlasting everyone. And so there is this very matriarchal thing, and we have young Bertha, who is going to carry on the line. But then the old woman died the same year. So you have this kind of death after death after death. Père Rouault being paralyzed, it was an aunt who took charge of her. She is poor and sends her to work for her living in a cotton mill. So we've got a criticism here of the Industrial Revolution that was making its way. It'll be in the United States, I think 1901. Is that when thank you to my 9th grade American history teacher for that piece of information, if in fact it is correct. But before then, we have these cotton mills that would have been by the river in Rouen. So, but we have this sad thing where poor Bertha is, her mother commits suicide because she is not having successful affairs. Her father dies of some unknown reason. And as a young child, she's first shipped to her paternal grandmother, then to her maternal grandfather. Then she's being raised by an aunt and being made to work in a mill. So this is an interesting part, though. So in the last very brief 2 paragraphs of the book, since Bovary's death, 3 doctors have followed one another in Yonville without success. So promptly and thoroughly has Monsieur Homais routed them. He himself was an infernally good clientele. The authorities treat him kindly and public opinion protects him. He has just been awarded the Cross of the Legion of Honor. So this is such an interesting note. And again, I think it has to do with the plot here in the sense that Emma dies, Charles dies, things are not going to go well for Bertha. The people who will end up, doing well at the end of this novel, as far as we can tell, is l'heureux, who is, the happy one, who is the money lender, and who is the peddler of all sorts of material goods, and Monsieur Homais, who is the apothecary, who is sort of this harbinger of this harmful science and sort of general quackery. So the end of the book is so interesting. It starts very much, I feel, like the beginning. It's kind of this, like, we're thrust into this story. We're given a bunch of context in a classroom. And then at the end here, we're ending on the note of the apothecary getting the Legion of Honor. So we have these kind of oblique beginnings and ends, which I really appreciate because I think, again, this is an anti-romantic push by realism. And it's also a sense of this is how real life is. There are classrooms and there are bad people who are really, aggressive and egocentric and pushy. And those people are going to, succeed in the sense of they are going to prosper and they are going to win awards. And the poor people like Charles are just gonna, they're just going to kind of blunder along with an unfaithful wife until they die on a bench and are discovered by their daughter. So I, of course, I'm saying that with a little irony, a little tongue of cheek, with quite a bit of pathos, all intertwined, as Nabokov said. So I thank you very much for allowing me this deep dive into Madame Bovary. And I hope that, honestly, I feel like we've barely scratched the surface and we've talked for a full 90 minutes. But I hope that this does give you some new insight as to why the book is important, why it has endured, why someone like Lydia Davis took the time and energy to translate it, and why it's a book that still actually has a lot to tell us about today, a lot to tell us about happiness and material consumption and the holes in science and the idea of pride and of vanity and of infidelity. So I think it's a fun book to read, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that the lectures have been helpful. And I hope to see you back again here sometime soon. Thank you. I'm so glad you're here to take a look at the images that I've pulled for Madame Bovary. So here we obviously have a map of France. It's interesting to me how far north our setting is. This is Rouen, the little red bubble thing there. And it's worth noting it's very, far north. The weather would have been cold and a little grim. And they're right on the Seine. So it's this bourgeois industrial setting in the north of France. Here is Flaubert himself. I'm really enjoying that walrus crazy mustache he's got and how it's nicely mirrored by that hairdo. He's looking like quite the fop in this picture. Then we have, by contrast, this incredible photo of Lydia Davis, our really, really bright, just general badass translator of not only Flaubert, but also of Proust, who just did a great job with Madame Bovary. This is the last standing building, the only thing that remains of the Flaubert family estate near in Yonville, I believe. Again, an upper middle class family, surgeons, decent amount of money, cute little house. And here is Rouen. I was so happy to find this photo because it really gives us a sense of what this town might have looked like even when Madame Bovary was there. This is a smaller town nearby, but it really gives you that sense of that Norman architecture. And this is a hotel that was the inspiration for the Hôtel de Boulogne, which is where Madame Bovary and Léon have their 3-day honeymoon. And if you look up images for Madame Bovary, there are lots and lots of artistic renderings of her death, which is just so macabre, but also kind of fitting. So here we have the agony, and here we have a slightly more pensive, duo by the bed. There are always lots of people around, all of the various doctors not being able to do anything, and Charles in agony. Here's another image of Charles. I love this because this is kind of... there's something about the closeness of the eyes, and I'm not even sure why, but these images are, these two both in particular, are pretty fitting with what I think of as Charles as being not the debonair rake that the rest of the men in the novel end up being. Here again, we have a slight, not exactly a buffoon, but we have a little bit of a, there's just something about this gentleman here and his mustache that makes me think of mediocrity. This, on the other hand, though, I left in the Ken Burns dramatic thing that's happening. We're zooming in to see him, just because I think here we are leaning back toward a slightly more homely version of Charles Bovary, which I think is a bit more fitting, and that's the amazing Isabelle Huppert. Here again, we have the same Isabelle Huppert, and this is, a perhaps slightly more awkward version of our Charles Bovary. This Charles Bovary Country Doctor, this is a book I highly recommend by Jean Amery. He was originally written in German, but it really imagines Charles as not being quite the wimp that he is in Madame Bovary. Now, what follows are just a whole series of images. There's so many images of Madame Bovary. I think she's, a character, in literature, obviously, who's had many different iterations, but certainly in the public sphere. So in movies and in films and in plays, all through the ages, This is like a very Scarlett O'Hara kind of moment here. I think the hat is making me think that. So you have lots of, throughout all of these different time frames, beginning in the 19th century, these different artistic renderings. But again, I'm really enjoying some of the filmic ones. This I love. Elle refuse de n'être qu'une victime, that she refuses to be just a victim, which I think is highly debatable as a sentence, as a tagline for Emma Bovary. Looks like a beautiful film, but I'm not really sure that we can say she's a whole lot more than a victim of her circumstance. And here we have this beautiful sort of soft, soft focus thing. I believe that might be Isabelle Huppert again. And here we have a much more dramatic and much more stark vision, which actually appeals to me more. This is going to be toward the end of the movie, where Emma is in agony in more ways than one. And I love this image. This is an actress. She's Australian, and she was actually in The Kids Are All Right, which was just a movie that I really loved. It was haunting me what else she'd been in. And here we have a final vision, a very colorized vision of our Madame Bovary behind the veil. So thank you for taking the extra time to tune in. I hope that these images have expanded your sense of the novel a bit. Readers, thank you so much for tuning in today. The lectures really are the lifeblood of the Fox page, but you should really go to thefoxpage.com. There are 5-minute recommendations where I will predict in about 5 minutes whether you should or should not tackle Ulysses, or maybe why you shouldn't be so snobby about the recent Leanne Moriarty beach read. There are also talks, no rereading required, on old favorites like Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, or Frog and Toad, which is, quite frankly, a literary masterpiece. There's also this very cool thing where you answer a couple of questions and this cool wheel spins around and spits out a recommendation that I think might be exactly what you need, and it might be something that stretches you a little bit. Come and check out thefoxpage.com. Thanks for listening, and mostly, happy reading.